What is going on with After Effects? Let's talk about it. So I've been using After Effects for over 20 years, but in the last few years, Adobe has really been on a tear, adding a ton of new features, and they've recently added some really major ones. So I kind of want to read between the lines and try and predict where this app is going and why Adobe is developing it in this way. And I want to start with the biggest new feature launched in recent years, which is a fully 3D renderer inside of After Effects. So here is a very simple render that has 4 3D things in it. It's got an iPhone, a laptop, a watch, and it's got 3D type. The 3D type is the only thing that is native After Effects. Everything else was imported from Spline 3D, which is where I got these models from. Now, inside of the pre-comp that built that scene, you can see that there are these objects I can literally just grab. I can hit W to grab the rotate tool, and I can literally move these things around in real time inside of After Effects. It's actually kind of mind-blowing how good this is already, even though it is a very, very early version of the feature. Now, currently, I have the one environmental light inside of this scene turned off. When I turn it on, it's gonna make the render times a lot slower. So I'm gonna leave that off for a moment. But let me do a quick RAM preview just so you can get a sense of the performance here. It's actually a pretty quick renderer. The quality isn't bad at all. Now, as of this recording, there's a lot of bells and whistles that are not available yet. There's no depth of field on the built-in 3D renderer. There's no motion blur on the built-in 3D renderer. And you're very, very limited in terms of what you can change as far as the way materials react. Lighting isn't very easy yet, but this is sort of like the beginning of this feature, and you can see where it's going. Now, we've had 3D type inside of After Effects for a few versions. Now, if I open up the properties here, you can see that I've extruded this and I've added a little bit of a bevel, and that was mostly just to give it a way of catching the light when I turn the lighting on. So as I mentioned, these 3 3D objects, these came from Spline 3D. Working with them inside of After Effects is pretty intuitive. There's a nice bounding box. You get this nice gizmo that can help you rotate things if you want. And all of these things have keyframes on them, so they are rotating a little bit as the camera pushes in. Now, this is a true 3D system. These can actually interact with each other. And so, for example, if I take this iPhone model and I move it to where it's going to intersect with that laptop, you can see it actually calculates precise occlusion and intersections, and it works really well. But with lots of 3D renderers, including Redshift for Cinema 4D or Blender's renderers or Element 3D, even if you're using that inside of After Effects, they have amazing lighting and shadows and can render really well. So how does the built-in After Effects 3D system render at this point? Well, to show you that, I'm gonna show you an environmental light and the effect it's gonna have on the scene. So right now, to render a frame, if we look way down here, pretty darn quick, and I should mention I'm on an ancient iMac Pro. I really am in need of an upgrade here. This is a 2017 iMac Pro. It was pretty specced out for the time, but now it's definitely a little long in the tooth. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn on an environmental light, and this is a relatively new feature inside of After Effects as well, which is gonna let me use an HDR image as the lighting. When you add a light in After Effects, there's now an option for an environment light, and you can use this to load in HDRs into your scene. Here's one I found for free on the internet. I loaded it in, and when I turn this on, I want you to watch how long it takes to render the shot. So there we go, it just rendered, and you can see there's some nice soft shadows here, and everything looks just a little bit nicer. The type even looks nicer. This is actually decent quality, but it did take 18 seconds for one frame. Now, of course, a lot of that has to do with my ancient system, but I think also this 3D renderer needs a lot of optimization inside of After Effects to be really useful. There's also still kind of this quirky way that you have to work with the renders coming out of the 3D system in After Effects. For example, if I wanted to color correct this watch, well, I can't actually do it inside of this scene without jumping through a bunch of hoops. I have to create a layer that references this. I'll show you in a minute how it works, but it's kind of clunky to work with. And so for this scene, I ended up just throwing it into a pre-comp and pre-rendering this, putting a little bit of color correction, a little bit of a glow on it. This took about an hour to render on my system, and it's about a 5-second shot. I'm used to using Element 3D. If you're unfamiliar, it's an amazing plugin from Video Copilot, and it renders way faster at this point than the built-in After Effects renderer. I think it's a different rendering technology. It works really, really well for stuff like this. It has depth of field. So I would still be using that primarily as opposed to this. But I think it's interesting that Adobe has given us access to this feature even at this early stage. So here's what that final render looks like, and you can see there's some nice soft shadows here on the watch. There's also some little render artifacts, and if I wanted to clear that up, I could up the quality of the 3D renderer. back inside this pre-comp, if I open up the comp settings and I go to the 3D renderer, it's set to advanced 3D. This is the new full 3D renderer inside of After Effects. And if I click on options, you'll see right now the render quality is set to 12 and the shadow smoothness is set to 16. Now there's a whole bunch of options here, but I can crank up this render quality way higher. It's going to make my render times even worse. But this is very likely just increasing the number of samples that we're going to get in the render so we can get a smoother result with less artifacts. And a very new feature is the ability to import 3D models that have animation baked into them. So this is a model that I got off of Sketchfab. It's a free model, but it had animation baked into it in the GLB format. If I open up the properties for this layer, you'll see there's animation options, and you can actually have multiple animations baked into a model and choose between them. This one just has one labeled scene, which is sort of this idle cycle here with this little spider. But again, with no lights on, I mean, it's kind of crazy how responsive this is even on my old machine. And the quality of the textures, the way materials look is really, really nice. And I think that's a testament to the fact that Adobe acquired, years ago at this point, Substance. And Substance has a really great material shader system and rendering engine. And that's made its way into After Effects. And so if I ram preview this, you can see we actually have a fully animated, pretty decent looking 3D render natively inside of After Effects. Now, just for fun, I shot a little scene inside of my office and I tried to track the spider into the shot. I set up a shadow catcher and a reflection layer here and did a little color correction just to see what kind of quality you could get out of native After Effects. And I gotta be honest with you, I'm pretty blown away, actually. Now, there's a whole bunch of trickery I had to do to actually get this scene to composite well. Obviously, this is pretty rough and it could be better. However, considering that I did not have to leave After Effects at all to do this, is pretty amazing. And I can imagine in the future when this feature is more developed and it's a little bit easier to do things like depth of field and motion blur, and maybe the render times are a little faster or I finally upgrade my machine. This is going to unlock a lot of really cool opportunities for newer After Effects artists. And that's a hint. That's a hint about what I think Adobe is trying to do here. Just to show you sort of how this scene is set up in case you're curious. So I have a separate shadow comp here, which has a shadow catcher in it. And you can see how grainy the shadows are. I could have bumped up the shadow quality, but it would have made my render times even worse. So what I ended up doing was just putting a blur on this layer, and the opacity is toned down a little bit so you can't really see the graininess. Now, currently, the way that you apply effects to a 3D render is you need to have a shape layer or a solid. You then apply effect like CC Composite, which can reference another layer in your comp. And so I'm referencing layer 6, which is the 3D model of the spider. And so now this solid layer ends up being a 2D layer showing me the 3D render, which is great because now I can put effects on it. And so I did a little bit of color correction, a little bit of blur, force motion blur, and some noise just to try to match it to the scene. Let me turn that layer off for a moment. I'll turn the shadow catcher and this reflection layer off. I want to show you how I set this up. So here's the spider 3D object right there, but I also copied it and flipped it upside down so I could have an accurate reflection. Getting accurate 3D reflections is kind of a pain in the butt sometimes when you're compositing, but this makes it a lot easier. And you can parent things together in 3D. So if you move the original object, the reflection moves with it. This makes shadow compositing a little bit easier. So I can see a lot of advantages of doing things this way once this feature gets a little more blown out. So that's the 3D renderer inside of After Effects. Pretty cool, still very early days, but I'm pretty excited about it. And to me, this seems like a way for Adobe to make visual effects much, much easier inside of After Effects for beginners. Now, I still think that even when this feature is, quote, done, it's not gonna have anywhere near the power of Cinema 4D or, Blender or a dedicated 3D app like one of those. But it's gonna be good enough for a million use cases, especially for creators that just need to make things that look really cool, maybe promote themselves or promote a brand, but don't need the fidelity of a bespoke from scratch 3D scene. They can get on a site like Sketchfab or even Adobe Stock is starting to carry 3D models, and they can grab something cool, integrate it in their scene, composite it, and be done all in one step. It makes it a lot easier, especially as a beginner, to get into 3D. All right, let's talk about another feature that was added to After Effects a few years ago now. This isn't like a brand new one, but this is one that I find a lot of users still do not use and don't understand. And this is master properties, and it's like stupidly powerful. And I find a lot of After Effects users, especially ones around my age who've been using it for a long time and sort of have all this muscle memory, They don't use it, and it can save so much time. It's so powerful, but it's even more powerful for beginners. I'm gonna show you why. So first of all, what feature am I even talking about here? Okay, so I have this rig here to make these sort of isometric looking cubes and be able to animate them really, really easily, okay? So here is one of them, this little green one. If I hit U to bring up the keyframes, I'm just animating a slider that I have on here. So this is an expression control slider that is affecting the height of the square. Now, how is that working? Well, if I jump into the pre-comp, you can see that this is constructed out of shape layers and there's a bunch of null objects. And really, this is just kind of a clever expression rig. By the way, if you want to work with this rig and learn how I built it, you should check out Animation Bootcamp. That is where this artwork came from. And in that class, we actually get into how to build rigs like this and animate them. And in this case, I'm animating it with a little bit of overshoot. But here's the way the master properties feature becomes really, really useful. So right now, I have this rig that I've created with expressions. And if I click on the square shape layer, you can see all of these effect controls here. And these let me animate the height, the size of the outer square, the size of the inner square, the color of the inside, the outside, and this sort of shadow part, everything. I have a control right here, all driven by expressions. Now, let's say I wanted 6 of these in one shot, and I wanted them all to have different colors, different sizes, and animate independently. Well, prior to this feature, I would have had to have 6 different copies of this rig to be able to do it. But now what you can do is you can go up to Window and you can open up the Essential Graphics window. And then you can add keyframeable properties to this panel here. And you can even organize them into groups. Like I have my main square group, my inner square group. And what's cool is once you've set this up, these controls also control the rig. So I can just use these controls if I want to. So this is kind of nice. There's a lot of uses for this. You can use this to create MoGRT files for your editor. But there's an even more powerful way of using this. So let's go back into the master comp. So here's my cube rig, and if I double tap U and I close down the effects and close down these, you'll see this group called Essential Properties. And to make this even a little more clear, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna duplicate this layer and I'm gonna solo it. So all of the original layers are turned off. I'm gonna get rid of all my keyframes. So we're just starting from scratch here, okay? So I have this cube rig and I can move it around. But what's cool is I can actually control the expressions inside of the pre-comp by using those essential properties. So if I open this up and I go down here to essential properties, you can see there's expression on height, there's an expression on shadow color, main square, inner square, and those expressions are being driven by expression controls on that layer. Now you don't have to do it this way. You don't have to use expression controls. You can just go into essential properties and animate things however you want to. This is just a little bit more of a user-friendly way of using it. But if you look down here in essential properties, when I change this height slider, it's just changing the essential properties down here, height. If I change this main square color to something else, let's make it pink, it automatically updates. Now, this is great. This is a nice rig, and it makes it a lot easier to use than having to go into this pre-comp and do everything inside of there. But the real power is now I can duplicate this. I can have another square over here. This one has its own set of essential properties, right? I can go down here and it's got its own essential properties. And what's amazing about this is now I can change that color and I can have completely different looking asset here than this one, but they're built out of the exact same comp. I built this cube rig one time and I added the properties I wanted to animate to the Essential Graphics panel. And now I instantly can have as many of these cubes as I want. They can all be different. I can animate them all differently. And even better, if I decide to make a master change to this, like let's say, for example, that inner stroke around that inner square, I want that to be thicker on all of them. Well, that's pretty easy. I can just go into the rig. I can click on the shape layer here. I'll double tap U to bring up all the properties I've changed. And you can see inside of that, one of the layers I have is an inner square. And there's a stroke on it. So if I open up the properties for the stroke, I could change that stroke width from 2 to say 5. Now it's thicker. If I then pop back out, I'm just gonna hit tab and use the flowchart to go back to my master comp. All of them have updated, but they've all maintained the colors and the size and the height that I had set for all of them. So this is essentially a feature about letting you build a rig once and use variations of it anywhere you want without actually having to make duplicates and manage all the craziness that happens in the past when we were using expressions that we're trying to duplicate across different rigs. Now, if you want to see just how powerful this feature can get, check out this video from instructor Jake Bartlett, who shows you how you can use the essential properties and the master properties features with Rubber Hose, one of the most popular character rigging plugins, to make one rig and be able to use multiple copies of that rig with different variations, totally different animation. And then if you need to update the master rig, you can, and it'll propagate those changes to all of the copies of that rig that you've been making. Now, why do I think this is important? It's because this feature is very, 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 very useful to advanced After Effects users, people who've been using it for a long time, because you can build fancy rigs, but now you have so much more power in the way you can use them. And it's much easier to build up really, really complicated systems built around one rig. In the past, that was kind of painful to do. But it's also incredibly powerful for beginners who can now use those rigs in really cool ways without really having to understand how they work and how they're built. You can create a control interface for these complicated rigs using the Essential Graphics panel, and then you can use master properties to control those inside of a master comp, and you don't need to understand how they're built. I could give you an After Effects project with this rig in it, and you do not actually need to know how it works, but you can still use it and animate with it however you want to. And in fact, that is what I've done. If you follow the link in the description, you'll be able to download this rig for free and play around with it and try this out. It's really fun to use master properties in this way. So again, this feature is yet another way that Adobe is making it easier for beginners and people who aren't super experienced yet to make things that are really cool as long as they have the help of more advanced users that are building assets for them. And this brings me to the last feature I want to talk about. But before I do, I need to remind you that at School of Motion, we have a full online curriculum that can teach you everything from After Effects to Cinema 4D to design to animation and so much more. We offer both self-paced classes as well as guided sessions, which are one-of-a-kind online cohort-based classes that feature world-class instructors teaching you professional techniques, a 24/7 vibrant online community of lifelong learners just like you, and critique on your work from your very own personal teaching assistant, a professional motion designer that is part of the School of Motion family. Check out our upcoming sessions at schoolofmotion.com. The link is in the description. Now, to explain this feature, I actually need to leave After Effects temporarily and go to Figma. I think looking at the way Figma is built may actually hold the key to understanding how After Effects, and frankly, most of the Adobe apps are going to work in the future, if I'm correct. So if you haven't used Figma, it's a design tool primarily used by product and web designers, but it's got this amazing feature. Up here, there's this little icon, and when I click it, I'm taken to the Figma community. This is built right into the app. And so if I come up to the search bar and I search for, say, grunge, you're gonna find lots and lots and lots of grunge assets that I can use, and a lot of them are free. So when we take a look at this first one, grunged peeled stickers free, I can double click this. It's gonna take me into a little landing page for it. I can then open this up directly inside of Figma, and all of a sudden I have access to all of these assets that I am allowed to use for free in my own design. So if I click on this stickers page, I can zoom in here and you can see I've got all these really neat things that might be really useful depending on what I'm designing. And by the way, you can download Figma for free, use a lot of these things for free, and bring them into Photoshop if you want to. You can export things really easily. So it's actually a great feature. Now, what does this have to do with After Effects? Well, Adobe has had this feature inside of After Effects for a while now, but they've started to actually do something cool with it, and that's the libraries feature. So I have the libraries window open here, and I think the way most people use it is you create your own library and you can save assets and stock photos and things like that in here. But watch what happens if I click Explore Libraries. So this opens up the Adobe Creative Cloud app, and it opens it up to the stock and marketplace screen. Now, right now, as of this recording, there's not a lot in here. There's some color swatches and there's some graphic elements you can use, but I thought this was kind of cool. There's an ink textures library that you can add to your library for free and use in your work. So I'm gonna click to add this to my library. Now, if I close this and I go back to After Effects, I have this ink textures library, and this will follow me around no matter which After Effects I'm opening, as long as I'm logged in using my Adobe ID. And if I click on this, you can see I now have all of these assets that are in the cloud, but I can grab them and download them instantly and use them in any comp. So if I want to add a little background texture to this to make it a little more interesting, maybe I could grab, let's say, this one, texture 11. I can just drag it right into my comp. It will download it to my computer and add it to my comp, and now I have this ready to go, and I can actually kind of play around with all of these. And while this certainly isn't going to win anybody an award, it's a little more interesting than what I had to start with. And I would have had to go and find something like this or license something. But it's so much nicer to have a curated collection of assets that in a couple of clicks you have access to and you can import into your project and use. Now, there's not a ton of this stuff, like I mentioned, available yet, but I have a feeling Adobe is going to lean into this pretty hard. And now that I've added these to my library, they're always going to show up. I can easily right-click and remove them if I don't want to keep them, but I'm going to keep these in here. I can explore more libraries. What else is there? Well, there's color palettes, there's some gradients, there's recommended fonts. But let's check out these faces from Dan Styles. I'm going to add that to my library and go back to After Effects. And here is that library right next to my ink textures. I can click to open it, and you can see there's a whole bunch of really cool artwork in here that I can use and throw into my comp if I want to. So if I wanted to have, I don't know, like this star, I could just click and drag it, and there it is. And now I have it. And this is an Illustrator file, so it's vector. And you can maybe start to see the potential here. If you're trying to design really, really quickly, and let's be honest, a lot of times when you're doing this professionally, you don't have a ton of time to design something from scratch, you know, for all your projects. And so if you have access to this library and it's integrated into the tool the way Figma's community is, you can design so much faster. And on top of that, if you're a beginner, you can use assets that are created and in some cases rigged by more advanced users. So the advanced users get more power, the beginner users get more ease of use from the same feature, which is pretty cool, I think. And while, as I mentioned, there's not a lot of stuff in here yet, I have a feeling that this is going to get a lot more full over the next several months. So those 3 features, and there are other ones, but I focused on these 3 because I think these 3 actually do a pretty good job of pointing in the direction Adobe wants to start moving. There's other hints too, like Adobe Express, which is sort of a watered down version of the design tools like Photoshop and Illustrator that everyone knows and loves, but are much more accessible, easy to pick up, quicker to use for someone who doesn't have a background using Photoshop for 20 years and doing design. And so while a real hardcore 3D artist isn't really going to love After Effects' 3D renderer, the beginner motion designer or the beginner visual effects artist using After Effects is going to love it because they're going to be able to make way cooler stuff much faster and more easily, especially when you layer in something like a library of pre-built assets. And I am telling you, one day there are going to be pre-built 3D models directly accessible inside of the libraries inside of After Effects with animations. You can drag them in, and then there's going to be an HDRI collection. You drag that in, now you have different lighting. And I suspect it's all going to be inside of every Adobe app, accessible whenever you want, paid and free assets. And if you layer on the power that comes with the Essential Graphics panel and the Master Properties feature, all of a sudden, maybe you can start to see the same future I'm seeing, where there's going to be this ecosystem of pre-built assets, design elements, and rigs that an After Effects artist can bring in as they're designing, as they're animating, and get a way cooler result in a lot of cases without actually knowing how those things are built and frankly, not needing to care. So to sum this up, I think what Adobe is doing is they're very smartly building features that we've been asking for years as sort of hardcore professional motion designers. And I'm happy to have the power that these features give me, but I actually think the more important thing about them is that it's going to make it much easier to learn After Effects and much easier to use. I know from talking with the Adobe team for years that After Effects is considered, even internally at Adobe, it's one of the most difficult products for Adobe users to use. It's just really complicated. It's such a Swiss Army knife, you know? And so features like the ones I showed you today, I think are a really good step in the right direction to make it more accessible, open the world of motion design and visual effects and compositing to more people, and hopefully make our lives easier too as professionals who have to get stuff done really, really quickly, day in and day out. So I hope you dug this video. I hope it was insightful, maybe got you thinking. I'm really curious if you agree with me or if you think I'm nuts. So please leave a comment below. And if you really want to dig into After Effects, not just After Effects, but design, animation, advanced techniques, check out our full motion design curriculum at schoolofmotion.com. And make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss any of the awesome content we have coming up. Thank you very much. See you next time.